Okay, great. I'm wearing two hats today. One is the hat of my home organization, something called the Transition Accelerator. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Um, the second one is I'm co-chair of something called the Net Zero Advisory Body. This talk is largely focused on one that I gave at a conference in Toronto called Retrofit Canada. Um, the Net Zero Advisory Body is a beast of the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And a lot of my talk is going to be to situate the concept of buildings, the concept of net zero buildings in the Canadian emissions reduction accountability framework that frankly is quite new. So I'm going to start off by describing the act here. And what it is a legally binding process to set 5-year national emissions reduction targets, and then to develop credible science or traditional knowledge-based plans to achieve the targets. It actually follows a real momentum around the world, not just to leave emissions reductions to the government of the day, but to actually entrench a legal requirement for national governments to drive a country to net zero. So Canada is no exception. So what the Act also does is come up with the first of 5-year targets. So the Act actually puts in place our 2030 emissions reduction target, and it is 40 to 45% below 2005 levels. It also puts in place some accountability measures like annual reporting and auditing. And it also, again, makes this body the Net Zero Advisory Body. And our mandate is to advise on these 5-year targets, and also to advise the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change and the Prime Minister and Cabinet directly on demand, advise them on the most likely pathways to net zero. What is the full suite of parameters, prescriptions that Canada has to do in order to drive our whole society to net zero? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done. Our terms of reference is actually quite enabling, I call it. Within that mandate, we have a budget for engagement, we have a budget for research, we have quite a strong secretariat out of the Environment and Canada and Climate Change Department. But there was one thing where the terms of reference was quite explicit and directive, and that is our first task was to essentially scan the world and take a look for where there has already been full pathways to net zero created, either domestically or internationally. And I think it was quite, it was a good idea to put that in the mandate. Like, why would we start from scratch developing pathways or advice to government around pathways? Let's not recreate the wheel. Let's take a look at what the approach that other jurisdictions have already taken and see if we could learn from that. So we did that. So we met with 14 groups, domestically and internationally, around the world. We didn't have a whole lot of time, so we didn't do a very detailed technical inspection of those pathways. And that's not really the function of the Net Zero Advisory Body. We're really there to give sort of real world advice. So what we did, instead of technical summary, we summarized those work into what we called initial observations. And there were 10 values and principles to guide the development of transition pathways that are most likely to lead Canada to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And these are the 10 values and principles really on which we said that we would base all of our future work. And remember, NZAB's a permanent institution. It's not just this group of people and these two existing co-chairs. NZAB will be on the landscape advising governments for 28 years, almost certainly across different political parties and through all the ups and downs of political life. So the 10 values and principles, we felt very strongly that we have to take a bit of a different framing approach to emissions reduction in the globe and in Canada. Right now, the framing is all negative. If you think about it, when people talk about climate change and they talk about emissions reductions, I'm quite confident when you think about it, your initial emotions and reactions will be something negative. It'll be around it'll be around a conflict about oil. It'll be about a conflict about a pipeline. It'll be about debate about a tax. But the reality is that we are going to have to retool our whole global economy, retool our whole Canadian economy. And in any type of change, there's opportunity. So we feel very strongly that this is a chance to take a step back and define, like, what do we want our future to look like? And as you take a look at these 14 pathways that other entities have created in other jurisdictions, most of them took this approach to say, you know what, the future that you can get in a net zero world actually is healthier, can be just as prosperous, it can be fairer, and it can be net zero. The difficulty, of course, is getting there, and there's great change, and there's great transition, and there's great cost to get there. But the reality is that this does not have to be only a negative framing. It could be a positive framing. So we had 5 what we call foundational values, and we felt strongly that Canada really need to seize the opportunities in the upsides. We're seeing this, frankly, I'm sitting here in my house in Alberta, and we're seeing a massive amounts of investment going into renewable energy. So this is not, even for the province of Alberta, highly dependent on fossil fuels, it's not just a downside. There actually are great upsides. We just have to seize them and not be sort of swayed by the defensive incumbents or the defensive nature of trying to protect something that is changing. We thought we had to put people first. The reality is that we have been taking mostly a technical and an economic view of emissions reduction for about 30 years since the UNFCCC was signed in 1992. But technologies don't make decisions, and economic models don't make decisions, people do. So we really have to put people first and understand the human element of this. We have to motivate, empower Canadians. Again, most of our framing for emissions reduction has been negative. We must change or something bad will happen. Well, the reality is, if we change, good things will happen as well. So that positive framing we thought was very important. Canada is a complex democracy. We have essentially 4 levels of government with Indigenous government. There are great tensions among governments and tensions among regions. But the reality is that we have to find ways to put those aside, because in one very, very real framing, we are all in this together. So we need to collaborate every step of the way. Having said that, there are very real regional differences and very real regional circumstances that must be respected. So we can't just have a one-size-fits-all national type of approach. We need to understand the regionality and incorporate that into our thinking and our work. The design principles, I would say the foundational principles are interesting, they're necessary, but I don't think anyone's going to find them terribly earth-shattering. The design principles, at least some of them, we feel are really new contributions to this body of work and contribution to the framework and the philosophy that we're going to have to follow in order to be successful in this great quest to net zero. One, of course, is to act early and urgently. We'll talk a little bit about sticker shock. We see an awful lot, especially of defensive sectors, drawing attention to the great cost of transitioning to net zero. They'll come up with a number, this many million or billion or trillion. And that's interesting. But the reality is that a cost of something is always meaningless without context. So picture you buying a house, and the house is $10, just for my little goofy argument here. Question is that a good deal or not? Well, if the house right next door, exactly the same house right next door, sold for $12 yesterday, then that $10 house, it's a smoking deal. It's fantastic. But if that same house right next door was sold for $8 yesterday, then $10 is too expensive. So the reality is that when we see these big numbers, that's interesting, but what's the context? And here's the context that we learned from these 14 groups that we met. One is the cost is only going to go up. So despite it being sticker shock and being a high cost, the actual cost financially to the society of the effects of climate change are likely to be higher, and the costs are going to go up. So those are the two main pieces of context. And the reason that the cost will go up is as we delay or dither or don't act that quickly to get to net zero 2050, options fall off the table. So we've seen that in the automotive sector. I mean, if we had acted decisively 15 years ago for emissions reduction in the personal vehicle sector, we could probably still have internal combustion engines on the road. we just had to make the fuel much more efficient. Well, it's not good enough anymore. We actually have to get the internal combustion engine off the road now. We've lost options because we dithered. And of course, you see governments around the world coming up with their zero emission vehicle mandates. So act early and urgently. Number two, be bold and proactive. This is very difficult, but I'll give some examples around this in a second here. The third one here is acknowledge that there's more certainty than uncertainty. And we are increasingly parsing certainty into two types. One is policy certainty. What that means is, a question, a company or a sector or a government asking, like, are the rules going to change? In a democracy like Canada, it's really difficult to say that the rules were not going to change. We have frankly, all of our federal conservative leadership candidates essentially saying that they will get rid of the liberal charge on carbon, the carbon tax. That's not great certainty, and that's very difficult. People are experimenting with options to give certainty. For example, something called contract for differences that is coming onto the landscape quite quickly. And that is the government entering into a contract with companies around some of their emissions reductions initiatives that basically bake in the cost of carbon, so that even if a future government gets rid of the charge of the carbon tax, that this company already has a contract with the government, that the government would be on the hook even if the tax was taken away. So it's basically baking in the carbon tax into a legal framework rather than simply a legislative framework. Interesting. I said there's two types of certainty, policy certainty, but there's also technical certainty. And our assertion at the NZAB is that there's much more technical certainty than we think there is. And here's the difference. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but there's really almost limitless ways you can reduce emissions. But there's very few future systems that can be functional and actually net zero. So this concept of net zero, the mandate now that we have been given by scientists to actually eliminate emissions under a net zero definition actually gives us more certainty. The reality is that there's no credible future transportation system that can be net zero and functional with internal combustion engines on the road. So there's this notion of net zero actually brings us more technical certainty than less. It doesn't make the job any easier, but it brings us more technical certainty than less because it takes options off the table. The fourth here is don't get caught in the net. Remember, net zero is an equation. Anthropogenic emissions into the atmosphere minus anthropogenic emissions out of the atmosphere over a certain time frame. So there's going to be a great push and the temptation to focus less on emissions reduction, meaning putting less emissions into the atmosphere, and focusing on the removals, the netting out of emissions, or the net side of the equation. Of course, that can be done technologically at emission sources like carbon capture and storage, or it can be done technologically through direct air capture. There are technologies where essentially you can scrub emissions right out of the air, or it can be done using some type of natural nature-based solutions. But we feel that the challenge is going to be so difficult that we can't actually rely on the netting technologies, the netting approaches. We have to do everything we possibly can to reduce emissions across all sectors on the reduction side of the equation, and reserve the netting technologies for the last sort of very recalcitrant, difficult technologies, difficult emissions, so we can get to the net zero equation. And the fifth one here is beware of dead ends. This one is difficult, but I've got a little cartoon here that I think does a good job of explaining this. This is from David Lazell, one of our transition accelerator energy system architects. He made this. But what's a dead end pathway? Well, a dead end pathway is something that locks in system components that will become emissions liabilities by mid-century. So if I take a look at this little cartoon on the right here, we've got two mountains. And the whole idea is that the higher you go on the mountains, the less emissions that you have this could be a technology system, it could be a company, it could be sort of anything. It's sort of a flexible framework. But we've got a little hiker down on the left here. It's got dog and backpack, and she's trying to reduce her emissions, so she needs to gain elevation. So she has two paths. One of them leads to really quick emissions reductions. This is this red path. So he or she might be very tempted to take this path because you're quickly reducing emissions. The problem with this pathway is that it tops out. It leads to a dead end, and you get to a point where you can't reduce your emissions anymore on that pathway. So an example of this might be liquid natural gas heavy duty vehicles. So it's very tempting to change your whole truck fleet, if you're a trucking company or a sector, into liquid natural gas. You can reduce your emissions by changing your truck fleet from diesel to liquid natural gas up to about 50%. That's really, really appealing. The problem is that once you reduce it 50%, there's nowhere to go at that point. You can't reduce the intensity of your trucking fleet anymore using that technology platform, and you've got to start again. So you've got to completely retool it and go to hydrogen, or you've got to completely retool it and go to electric. So this is what we call a dead end pathway. It's something that's very seductive, leads to quick short-term emissions reduction, but but results you in locking in system components that you have to change that result in lost time and overall higher cost to get to actually net zero. And of course, this green pathway is a true pathway capable of actually getting you to net zero. So we really think that this is a paradigm that is incompletely understood and explored across the world, and certainly in Canada here. So, what else could be a dead end pathway? Well, bringing on additional fossil fuel electricity could be thought of a dead end pathway. The reality is that the world's very complex. People do need energy. So in some cases, we will have to take imperfect steps in order to get to net zero. But this dead end pathway paradigm, I think, is a really good one to apply as a challenge function to any proposed, especially public investment in pathway development. So, and I'm just going to flag here that my code is dead pathways, all capitals. People should know what that means. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. So I've talked an awful lot about pathways. I'm just going to talk a little bit more what the heck a pathway is. And what we see a pathway is essentially all the elements required to transform a system to better respond to a societal need and to meet a net zero emission goal. We've usually thought about pathways in the past, again, as technology, and economics, or policy. One thing NZAB is really trying to do is to get us to think much more expansively around that. So a pathway could be technologies for sure, could be infrastructure, but it also could be business models, it could be societal practices, it could be mindsets or social norms, governance structures, reporting requirements. So it's essentially what's the full suite, not just of, I would say hardcore technology, but what people might describe as the softer things. How do people make decisions? What motivates people? How do you get people information? We really think that this more expansive sort of pathway perspective needs to be taken if we want to be successful on driving Canada to net zero. Okay, here's I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of these this new way of thinking, or some of these 10 principles that we came up with when we scanned the world for actual net zero pathways that had already been created. And when you add those up, you really come to the conclusion, of course, that net zero changes everything, and that we've really come from a reduction paradigm where it was okay, it was good enough to reduce emissions. But now we're in a fundamentally different paradigm, as an elimination paradigm. And when you think about it and really drill down into the implications, getting to zero, or elimination paradigm, does not mean just doing the things that you were going to do to reduce emissions better and quicker. They're fundamentally different challenges with fundamentally different solutions. And I'm just going to lay out a little bit here about the questions that dominated these two paradigms. So in the reduction paradigm, so again, this was think Copenhagen, think Kyoto Accord, questions that we had around the world and in Canada was, is climate change real? That was a legitimate question. There was scientific debate in the IPCC. If it was real, was it anthropogenic? I mean, was it human-caused climate change? And really, how important will these effects be? There was a lot of uncertainty, and certainly there were still interests seeding doubt and uncertainty. But the reality is that there was technical uncertainty. Is acting worth it? I mean, if you're going to take an action or make an investment in something, it's always prudent to ask, should we do this? Is it actually worth it? And it's interesting, even up into the end of this paradigm, going up to maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it seemed to be a great thing for a jurisdiction or a company to come out and say, like, we aspire to be net zero. For some reason, that was seen as interesting or a leadership or sufficient, but this notion of aspirations was very, very real and seemed to be sufficient for lots of companies and sectors and governments to sort of say, yeah, we agree with climate change and we actually agree we need to get to net zero. Personally, I thought it was always a bit of a hollow thing, but this notion of reduction aspirations was real. Now we've got this elimination paradigm, and the answers to these questions are nailed. Is climate change real? Yep. Is it anthropogenic? Yep. How important will effects be? Vary. The cost of acting is less than the cost of inaction, less of the cost of acting. So is acting worth it? Yes. And now, not only do we just need aspirations or agreeing with the problem, we actually need plans. And we need independently verified plans that in order for jurisdictions and sectors and companies and regions to drive to net zero. Fair enough. These are actually fairly easy. So let me go on to the next slide here. I've hinted at some of these. This is a bit of a summary slide. In a reduction paradigm, there's many options to reduce emissions, because all you have to do in a reduction paradigm is to really make your underlying system more efficient. You can keep the same system of energy, just have to make it more efficient. You can keep the same system of transportation. You just have to make those transportation systems more efficient. You can take the same system as buildings. I'm going to tie this back to buildings here. So under reduction paradigm, there's many options to reduce emissions. So there's no system change needed. You just have to become more efficient. Because of that, really all you needed to do was change the system incrementally. And our whole way of operating, for when we plan things, when we cost them out, when we get them approved, I'm thinking infrastructure or even building codes or electricity grid. The whole way that we make these things are plan, engineer, build, approve, fund, operate. When we change those things, they're all designed to be incremental changes. We're not set up really for fundamental system change. So the current tools that we have were actually then that whole system that I just described there, that sort of value chain of an idea to a project or a build. Our current way of doing that, our current tools are actually quite sufficient. Our risk frameworks, our analytical models, our tools, the way we finance things. The world worked. That way that we did things evolved over decades, but evolved in sort of smart ways. In some, with all the vagaries and efficiencies of a democracy, it actually works pretty well. Now we're in elimination paradigm. Everything changed. Net zero changes everything. And we actually the Transition Accelerator gives a full day's course on this. But in this elimination paradigm, there's actually very few options to eliminate emissions, because many of the reduction options are actually dead ends. We have tools. They are flogged by companies or sectors that can make money at it. And emissions reduction feels good, but they're actually dead ends on the way to net zero. So really, in many cases, we actually need a fundamentally new system, complete system change required. We're seeing that in transportation before our eyes. We're seeing it in energy before our eyes. I guess one of the questions is, are we seeing that before in buildings before our eyes in the built environment? Talk a little bit about that in a second. And the implication of this notion of that moving from incremental change is that incremental change actually won't yield a fundamentally new system. You sort of can't get there from here. I'll show you the next slide on that. So, we have to think about this notion of our tools as we build things, as we plan society and build it out. Our tools are actually insufficient. So let me give you an example here. Again, sort of a bit of a restatement. There are many ways to reduce emissions, but few systems can be functional in net zero, and incremental changes won't result in net zero systems. So, this pie diagram here on the left is a bit busy, but don't worry about the details. This is our current energy system based on real data. This is from Natural Resources Canada, real data. So it's dominated by fossil fuels. We've got some electricity. We've got some biomass, and you can see there's basically greenhouse gases emitted from basically all parts of it. Of course, not some of our electricity system emitted, but there's embedded carbon even in hydro and nuclear, and there's embedded carbon even in biomass when you do full life cycle analysis. So anyway, so this is our existing system. Under the emissions reduction paradigm, we would come up with tools like the Clean Fuel Standard, which requires companies to decrease the carbon intensity of their gasoline, of their diesel, of their jet fuel, for example. That's an incremental change, causing emissions reduction. But how can you ever get how can you ever get to zero if what you're doing is just decreasing the emissions intensity of diesel? There's certainly not enough land base to grow enough biomass to make zero emission fuels, and frankly, you can't get zero emission fuels. Even ethanol has an emission. So here's our existing system. Incremental change will not yield a new system. So the point is that we feel very strongly is that what we have to do is we actually, for the first time, we have to define the future systems and then build a pathway to them. If we actually need a fundamentally new system, then we're not going to get there incrementally. It's not going to just magically emerge. We actually have to define the new system and build a pathway to it. So, we took a crack at it. This is almost certainly going to be wrong. No one can predict the future, but there's a remarkable amount of consensus emerging around the world about what the necessary net zero future energy systems are. So it's almost certainly going to be massive electrification, but you can't electrify anything. Batteries get too heavy, for example, to move heavy things around the landscape. So we'll have to use hydrogen as a zero emission fuel carrier at end use. So this is almost certainly what a net zero energy system is going to look like. Lots of electricity, lots of hydrogen, probably still some fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, biomass, and so on. So the point is that this paradigm from emissions reduction to emissions elimination means that we have to fundamentally change our approach. Instead of incrementally changing existing systems and hoping that new systems will magically appear, the infrastructure that you need for new systems, you actually have to think about it, plan it, and build it. Design the new system, and then build a pathway to that new system. Okay, most of this I've been talking about here is sort of the theory. I'm going to talk a little bit more about buildings. So this notion of what's the obstacle to net zero building sector, I've came up with sort of 5 main ones. I think there's probably lots more. I think one of the problems is our complex Canadian political structure. So this is not just the regionality, the intense regionality that's focused on different cultures and different underlying economic drivers regionally. Think the difference between Alberta and Quebec. But it's also our levels of government. We have a great democracy, we have a great confederation, but the split in power constitutionally between the federal government, the provincial governments, municipal governments, and increasingly the Indigenous governments, that's a real power struggle. And when you take a look at the federal government's role in driving emissions to zero, some of the emissions are directly under the federal jurisdiction. Think ports, think airports, I mean, these are institutions or organizations that are constitutionally under federal control. But when you think buildings, of course, that's not under federal control. So we have this odd dynamic in Canada, many countries have it, where you've got a national government that negotiates on the international stage so that Canada can play its part in driving the world to net zero. But legally, the government of Canada doesn't have all, and frankly, doesn't even have most of the legal levers in order to come up with policy or regulations to drive sectors to net zero, including the building sector, of course. So when you actually sort of unpack this, you start to see the leadership very much required in building sector is actually at the municipal level. And this is why you have hundreds and hundreds of municipalities, of course, around the world coming up with basically bylaws that are putting in, like Toronto, city of Toronto, putting in place a carbon intensity required of future heating systems that essentially scope out fossil fuels. So this complex Canadian political structure is a challenge for us, for sure. It'd be much easier to have a benevolent dictator to be able to pull all the levers necessary to get all sectors to net zero. That, of course, would give us different problems as well, though. We've got the building sector is an ownership structure. This is not like oil and gas, where half of the emissions in the oil and gas sector basically comes from 6 companies, the 6 oil sands companies. So it's actually quite easy to regulate the oil sands companies. There's literally 6 people you have to talk to. Of course, the building sector is at the other end of the spectrum, utterly distributed, public and private, thousands and many owners and renters. So the structure of the sector is extremely difficult. I think the issue is, for the building sector, is that we've actually got an extremely efficient problem. And that is, the people that have developed the heating systems and the energy production, distribution, and use systems, they've done a really good job of it over the decades. It's really efficient. Heating in this country and cooling is extremely cheap compared to most other countries. Part of that is policy. Part of that just the efficiency that we do with that we've been able to impart into that sector. So it's difficult coming up with solutions that are trying to displace something that's really, really efficient. And then, of course, the cost of solutions, again, it's sort of the same problem. It's sort of the same problem. In the emissions reduction paradigm, companies or people or sectors, jurisdictions sort of sat back and said, like, we're not going to change unless, the solution is the same cost or even cheaper than our existing solution. Of course, the problem is that we're not internalizing the actual cost of the problem, emissions, climate change, and so on. So you've got this utter externality here that is, that utterly warps the economics, and the economic arguments to say no one should be asked to change their, for example, heating solution until the economics work for them. That's actually extremely hollow argument, because the economics of the current situation is utterly artificial. So they may be real in terms of money out of people's pocketbooks, but they're utterly artificial. And I'd say the last thing here is this remarkable sophisticated resistance to progress as well. And when you take a look at for example, the natural gas sector, they are extremely sophisticated in basically convincing people that the key pathway to net zero is to replace coal with natural gas. And again, the answer is, well, we certainly will have our emissions reduction, but really it's a dead end pathway, isn't it? I mean, we're going to have to completely retool all of that gas infrastructure if we, by 2050, in 28 years, and to think that we can finance 2 wholesale changes between now and 2050, for me, stretches credibility. So, these are some of the, I would say, the conceptual, philosophical obstacles to net zero building sector. I think, this is one of the sectors in Canada where we're really going to have to come up with creative new types of models instead of retrofitting buildings one by one or block by block. There's got to be technical models. There's got to be finance models. I'd say one last thing here is that when you apply this emissions reduction and emissions elimination paradigm, in emissions reduction paradigm, physically retrofitting a building to make it more efficient was sufficient, right? But if you do that little thought experiment, and I'm sure you're all there already, but you do that little thought experiment, we could retrofit every single building in Canada, make it, what, 40% more efficient? That'd be fantastic and utterly insufficient. It's the fuel. We have to do the fuel switching if we want to get to net zero. So in some weird way, I'm not espousing this, but we could not retrofit a single building, but if we did fuel switching, we could get to net zero. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but it does point out the thought experiments that you have to do as you go from emissions reduction to emissions elimination paradigm. Every net zero changes everything. That's what we put into our course. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about here. I think I have 2 more slides. The NZAB had the task of giving the government of Canada advice on 3 sectors. The minister asked us to focus on 3 sectors: oil and gas, transportations, and buildings in 2021 last year. And they wanted the advice given to them in time so that the advice could be used inside of their first emissions reduction plan that was put into the public domain at the end of March 2022. So this is extremely high level and incomplete summary, but if you're interested, you could go to the ERP or the emissions reduction plan that the government of Canada has on its website, and you can see the plan, and you can see the full suite of the NZAB advice as an appendix there. And we're quite happy to see that the government did take a fair bit of our advice. So in the buildings, we thought that the government should adopt a pathways approach, and that they should come up with a national net zero emissions building strategy. That's happening. We thought that they needed to accelerate and streamline the publication and adoption of a national model building code. So again, this tries to get at this idea, and people have been doing this a long time, this notion of a building code, but it needed to go quicker. That code could only be updated over multiple years. We just don't have multiple years. We need to update it quickly, be much more nimble on its design and implementation. The notion of regulation. So the private sector often says, like, just set the regulations and we'll take it from there. Maybe sometimes, but to the extent that we can have regulatory certainty, that's what the private sector is constantly asking for. So to come up with certainty on the trajectory of how we would decarbonize buildings on the way to 2050, we thought would be very important. So instead of, again, feeling good about a certain amount of money or a certain program now, let's start in the future, understand our true challenge of getting to net zero, and then backtrack and say what decarbonization has to happen how in the next 28 years, and with that, what are the immediate steps we have to do to be on track. Last point I've got here, but again, there's a fair number in the pieces of advice. Increase the ambition of the federal actions on property and integrate net zero requirements into federal funding opportunities. So this is sort of the federal government fully leaning into building decarbonization inside of their jurisdiction. This is one of the sectors where the provinces and the municipalities have basically most of the policy tools, but the government of Canada essentially is the largest building owner in Canada, so that they could lean harder into the buildings that they did own and incorporate this notion of net zero buildings into whatever appropriate federal funding opportunities there are, piggyback these issues into funding opportunities. So just to give you a slight peek under the hood, this is from the Net Zero Advisory Body. Our priorities this year are governance, ensuring that we have the capacity, strategy, and relationships required to get to net zero among institutions. Energy systems, what do the future energy systems need to look like? And then something we're calling Future Canada, and that is, can we actually understand where Canada can really compete in the world, in a net zero world, help drive the world to net zero, and double down on those sectors and companies and priorities so that we can actually become competitive, secure our economic place in a net zero future. So it's a little bit of an advertisement at the end there. So that is my talk. One last point here maybe is that another difference between the emissions reductions and emissions elimination paradigm is In emissions reduction paradigm, I'm being a little bit facetious, but basically everyone looked to the federal minister of environment and climate change and said, make it worth my while to act. If you're a company or you're a sector, it's your job to create the policy. I'm not going to act until it's sort of worth my while. That's not good enough anymore. We have a plan, and I think all of us, regardless of who we are, what we do, what our job is, or where we are in the stage of our life, we all have a leadership role to help drive to Canada to net zero. And we're really not going to get it done unless we all lean into it. So this notion of distributed leadership, we think is very important at NZAB, especially in buildings. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Dan. That was amazing. We have about 1 minute left, I think. If anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself. It's informal. You can put your camera on.
I put everyone to sleep, it looks like.
No.
Look, people, I appreciate you listening. Can head to the website, NZAB 2050. That's the Net Zero Advisory Body's website. Our Transition Accelerator website also has an awful lot of, I would say, techno-economics and good pathways work in there. It's a bit messy. We're right in the middle of cleaning it up. We also have a course, Net Zero Changes Everything course, and we've got 3 more courses coming online in the next about 6 weeks. So if you're interested in more of this type of thinking, then that's also another option, or just connect with me on LinkedIn. But I really appreciate the invite, and thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, Dan. I really, when you started off as thinking about it in a negative term, I mean, that to me, that's the forefront of what we're hearing about in the news all the time and everything. Like, I like that you started your presentation that way.
People don't react that well to, I'll give you 30 seconds of what we do at the accelerator. We launched this new organization because we thought we were missing the mark because of negative emissions reduction framing. The first thing we did was we went to about 10 change experts. We've been treating this whole emissions reduction issue as a technology and an economics issue, but it's not. It's one of the largest change management exercises the world has ever seen.
Yeah.
So we went to these change experts and he said, like, do you think we're doing this well? And they just laughed and they said, we're making every mistake in the book. One of them that really hits home for me is this idea that the change experts say it's almost impossible to get people to change from a known situation, even if it's really crappy. It's almost impossible to get people to change from a known situation to an unknown situation.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're doing, right? I mean, we're asking people, I live this every day, and we're asking people to change, into a net zero society, but no one really knows what that means to wake up. So that's where we got this idea of defining the future systems to demystify them. So
yeah, because my background isn't this, right? So I'm coming from that place of really not knowing, and fear, I think, is so, it just makes people be like, I don't want to deal with that, right?
Well,
that scares me.
Again, evolutionarily, we're hardwired to react more to fear than we are to hope.
Yeah.
Because, hope doesn't keep you alive, fear does, right?
Yes, it's so backwards. Yeah. But I just, that to me, like, starting off in that place for this, it made me want to, I was engaged, like, right away. So thank you. Yeah. All right. I got to head over to the next one, but thank you so much.
Bye now.
Okay, bye.